the American public gets little insight into the decision-making process.
You are not a brand. You are not a job title. You are not a social.
Kind of training up through high school. And then I went for a year to Peabody in Baltimore. And I worked with Fernando Lares, who was a disciple, so to speak, of Philippe. So it was a lot about doing books and books of exercises. After which that year didn't really work out that well for me, so I decided to transfer. And I took a year off in between, and I went to, there had been a Fleischer student who had studied with somebody in Philadelphia, who I became friends with, and she told me that there was a very good teacher in Philadelphia and that he could be, work on my technique if I wanted. And I thought, okay, that sounds good. So I worked with him for a year, and there were many things that he did that actually helped me quite a bit, and some things that didn't help me quite enough.
Sure.
So I transferred to Indiana University in Bloomington, and I auditioned for Enrica Cavallo Gulli. She was the wife of a very famous violinist, Franco Gulli. And she had been a prodigy, and she taught a lot through demonstrating and playing. She could play anything. I mean, if she hadn't played the piece in 40 years, she could just sit down and start it from anywhere. She was really quite phenomenal, and a beautiful, beautiful musician. So I think that by just observing her, and just her manner of teaching was to have two pianos in the studio. I sat at one and she sat at another, and basically she would go through the piece and she would play a passage and then say some things and ask me to play, and that was kind of like that. And I could observe her and observe the way she moved, and there were certain aspects of what she was doing that actually fused together with some of the things that I had learned previously. And I experienced a very big jump in my playing during my time at IU. And then I decided I really wanted to be back on the East Coast, so I came back to the same teacher I had worked a year between Peabody and Indiana, and I started to study with him again and do a master's degree. And it was somewhere in my master's degree that things really started to not go so well. And how it manifested for me was I started not being able to successfully get through a piece actually memory-wise. And I studied a lot of things about memorizing, and up to that point had actually been a very good memorizer. So it was very interesting. Somebody mentioned in a class that they knew of a woman in Brooklyn who knew a lot about piano playing, and I said, well, that sounds very interesting. So I decided to call her, which was Taubman. So that's how I ended up with Taubman. And she said, I have one lesson open, and it's Christmas Eve, and this was Christmas Eve of 1983. And I said, sure, I'll take it. So I went to Taubman on Christmas Eve of 1983, and I remember what I played. She asked me what would I like to work on, and I said, well, actually, I've been playing the Schumann G minor sonata, and I'd like to work on that. So I played the first movement, and I finished, and the first thing she said is, oh, thank God there's no damage to the hands. And I thought, I didn't even know where I was. It was the strangest experience. Like, no one ever said anything like that, even remotely to me. In fact, nobody said much about my hands at all. I thought that was very odd. But I thought, okay, well, I'm here, so I might as well keep staying here. So let me see if I can, learn something. So she said to me, well, are there any passages that you've practiced that you're not sure are going to come out when you sit down to play? And I thought, wow, she really wants to play, so okay, I'll play with this. This was fun. I thought for a second, there's this famous kind of octave passage with leaps in the Schumann G minor, dum da da dum, dum da da dum, and it gets increasingly wider and wider. I thought, okay, well, this is where I'm starting. And I said, I have a problem with this passage. And so she made me play it again, and she said, okay, now she came over to the piano, she demonstrated some very specific movements, and we rehearsed it like 2 or 3 times, and then she said, okay, now go faster. And I did, and in that moment, it was like it wasn't my hands. I felt something in my hands that I was very clear I had never been shown before in all my, prior to that, like 20 years of piano study. So
would you mind sharing what she showed you for that particular spot?
Yeah, sure. I can show you.
I played this during my doctoral studies. I love this piece. Such a great piece.
Oh, it's so awesome. Yeah, so I had some problems with this whole thing.
Uh-huh.
And it was like a little bit of a lottery. Sometimes I would get them, sometimes I wouldn't. And what she showed me was that there was really a very unique relationship here, what she called the closest note. So when I'm going from the first B flat to this D, she showed me that the closest distance was actually between my thumb and my 5th finger.
Yeah.
So, and then she showed me the rotational movement. Now I know that Taubman worked actually between my thumb, first B flat, to this D. She showed me that the closest distance was actually between my thumb and my 5th finger.
Yeah.
So, actually between my thumb and my 5th finger.
Yeah.
So, and then she showed me the rotational movement. Now I know that Taubman work gets kind of criticized for rotation, but it's actually a very natural motion, and it's actually the fastest motion that we have in the forearm. So when she showed me that I could actually move over my thumb to get here, all of a sudden that was very close. And then here, I actually only moving a step. So
right.
From this B flat to the C, and then when I move back, it's the same note. Same note, half step.
Awesome. So when you say moving over the hand, I think I understand, but would you be willing to clarify? What are you just talking rotating over the thumb? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, that movement comes when we train people with rotation and you train with a scale. In other words, if you don't have any rotation in your body, then the only way one can get over the thumb is to reach with the other fingers and reach over.
Sure.
Rotation in your body, then the only way one can get over the thumb is to reach with the other fingers and reach over.
Sure.
That motion of the finger, hand, and arm can roll you over the thumb. So it's a very fast motion that can roll you over that thumb.
Sure. And so coming down, that makes a lot of sense. Going up, do you feel a rotation this way and then you go back that way? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, that's accurate. So when you rotate in the ascending direction, when you play the 3rd finger, we're rotating to the right, and the thumb is playing to the left.
Awesome. Okay.
But I have to clarify that rotation is only one aspect of a technique. There are lots of other things happening in this scale that make it possible to go into speed and play very fast and even. flippantly. And it's not only rotation that's working here.
Sure. Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, finger activity. Are you? What would you refer to? Obviously, I have my own ideas of what goes into a fast scale, but I would be so interested to hear, along with that rotation, what are you focusing on to achieve that type of lightness and speed?
Well, they're basically the whole discovery that she made was that she couldn't understand how young people could play the piano so well without years of muscular development. Mm-hmm. Now, that was a very interesting insight at the time that she was living, because now you can go on YouTube and you can plug in 7-year-old Chopin etudes and you'll find numerous entries of 7-year-olds playing all of the Chopin etudes. But imagine 80 years ago with no YouTube, she had a kind of breadth of knowledge to understand that she saw this phenomenon happening too often to think that it was just a genetic kind of thing or just gifted, bestowed with wonderful technical prowess and not having to work for it. So she thought that was very strange, because she was also encountering people who were 20 and 30 years into a career who were still having technical problems. So how could this be possible that young children could intuitively understand how to play the instrument in a way that they would not need years of muscular development, years of exercises, all of those things? So It became her life's work in a way to understand what was happening in those children, because she felt if she could understand it, she could make that available to others who didn't feel it intuitively.
Sure.
And so what I've really realized is that every pianist does a certain percentage of things correctly. There would be no pianists. So there's a certain degree of things that are happening correctly. But to a certain degree, there are certain things that are not happening automatically. It doesn't mean that our intuition is always 100% correct. And what I mean by that is, if you go out into the cold, your intuition tells you to shiver. But that's actually not the best thing for your body, because when you constrict and shiver, you actually restrict the blood flow and you become colder.
Oh, so interesting. Okay.
Very often when you become cloudy, because when you tells you to shiver. But that's actually not the best thing for your body, because when you constrict and shiver, you actually
Ршмук, это лучше ршмук.
actually restrict the blood flow and you become colder.
Oh,
So
interesting. Okay.
very often our instincts, even though we follow them, are not actually the best solution to something. So
Okay.
you actually restrict the, actually not the best thing for your body, because when you constrict and shift, is, you know, if you go out into the cold, your intuition tells you to shiver. But that's actually not the best thing for your body, because when you constrict and shiver, you actually restrict the blood flow and you become colder.
Oh,
So
interesting. Okay.
very often our instincts, even though we follow them, are not actually the best solution to
Ну, это же
something.
лучше, чем если кровь будет остывать, правильно? Ну, наверное. Ну, а в чем логика? Что ты дрожишь, сокращаешься? Ну да, тепло бережешь, потому что, чтобы понимать.
Thing. So what she discovered was that
Ну, я здесь это
not
такое, что
everyone
такое
was.
Ну да, да, понимаю. Ну да. Наоборот. Ну нет, наоборот, это когда ты не 20 часов на холоде стоишь, наверное. Нет, наоборот.
Going to intuitively know how to move the best way across the instrument. So her first realization was that in some way she couldn't understand how could it to move the best way across the instrument. So what she discovered was that not everyone was going to intuitively know how to move the best way across the instrument. So her first realization was that in some way she couldn't understand how could a child have a very big sound, and some adults she was working with, actually some of very large stature, had a very small sound. How was that possible? And she first discovered that the finger, the hand, and the forearm worked together in some way. So when you unify the finger, hand, and arm, you overcome one of the two obstacles we have, or challenges we have in playing the instrument. So if I were to ask you the question, what are the two things any pianist has to accomplish to play a piece of music?
I mean, it boils down to sound and time. Is that what you're referring to?
No, physically.
Oh, physically. Transferring the weight in an effective manner, and putting the right amount of weight at the right time. Is that what you're asking?
Oh, that's
too.
Any pianist has to accomplish to play a piece of music. So if I were to ask you the question, what are the two things any pianist has to accomplish to play a piece of music?
I mean, it boils down to sound and time. Is that what you're referring to?
No, physically.
Oh, physically. Transferring the weight in an effective manner, and putting the right amount of weight at the right time. Is that what you're asking?
Oh, that's far more sophisticated than I'm asking.
Oh, okay.
There are only two things happening at the piano.
Just dropping and releasing.
Well, that's one of them.
Okay.
But that would mean that you enjoy playing pieces with one note in them.
Okay. Maybe you can help me out here. Sorry, I'm probably overcomplicating this.
It's really interesting because none of us, I mean, I have a master's degree, I have a doctorate, and anyone that I have ever taught and I've asked this question to has never actually formulated this question in a way to ask a teacher this question. But I think it's a very, very important question to ask, which is, there are only two dimensions happening here. The key is going down vertically, and we have to move horizontally, left and right.
Interesting. Okay, that makes sense.
Right. So really, when you think of her work, what she solved was what was the most efficient way to put the key down vertically, which was that the finger, hand, and arm could overcome the surface resistance of the point of sound or escapement very easily. Which was that the finger, hand, and arm could overcome the surface resistance of the point of sound or escapement very easily. What Ortman was that the finger, hand, and arm could overcome the surface resistance of the point of sound or escapement very easily. What Ortman also found was that a finger alone had to work very hard to put a key down. So the fingers alone have to work very hard. So what's interesting about this whole thing is that he sent pianists out, two groups of pianists. One group he said just play as you do normally, and the other group he gave finger strengthening exercises to increase the lifting and dropping capabilities of the fingers. And then he brought them back to Peabody. He had a laboratory there, and he tested them. And he found that the people who were exercising had no significant difference in the lifting or dropping capabilities or strength of their fingers. It was very interesting. But they did report certain discomforts. Mm-hmm. So he sent them out for another 6 months. And when they came back after that, many of them really had what we would call an injury, like persistent kind of discomfort, fatigue, pain. So what she realized from all of this was that the finger, hand, and arm of a child or any adult, once unified, has absolutely no problem putting a key down. And that becomes particularly significant at the fourth finger, because the fourth finger is double bound on top by the tendons, but there's nothing underneath the fourth finger. So the finger, hand, and arm, if it lifts, it can drop over the fourth finger with equal strength. So as in our drop over the fourth, so the finger, hand, and arm, if it lifts, it can drop over the fourth finger with equal strength. So as in our training with her, she always said your first order of business is to give somebody 10 strong fingers. But you don't give somebody 10 strong fingers by making them isolate the finger and exercise it, because that will never result in any significant change to the finger and can be very injurious.
Sure.
But if the person can drop equally on each note, that's one aspect of evenness. But the dropping or the transferring of weight does not solve the issue of how we move key to key.
Sure.
So we still have to move key to key. So if the premise is that the finger, hand, and arm has to be unified in its playing moment, then she understood that in some way, this unit, the finger, hand, and forearm, has to be able to move to the next key.
Right.
So what she for a very long time, she thought that it was just the finger, hand, and she understood that in some way, this unit, the finger, hand, and forearm, has to be able to move to the next key.
Right.
So the issue equally on each note, that's one aspect of evenness. But the dropping or the transferring of weight does not solve the issue of how we move key to key.
Sure.
So we still have to move key to key. So if the premise is that the finger, hand, and arm has to be unified in its playing moment, then she understood that in some way, this unit, the finger, hand, and forearm, has to be able to move to the next key.
Right.
So what she for a very long time, she thought that it was just a simple up and down motion, that allowed for that. But what she found out is that certain students went into speed, and it was very good, and they played pretty well. But there were a number of other students who could not break the sort of speed barrier.
Yeah, that would be my instinct. Is okay. That sounds great for slow tempos, but for fast tempi, what would it be?
Exactly. You know, it made her look further, and she realized that actually, along with the vertical moment, was a corresponding rotational movement. Now, the rotation is the only movement in the forearm that's as fast as the fingers. So the fingers move very fast, and the forearm rotation is the only movement that can keep up with those fingers.
Makes sense.
So the fingers move very fast, and the forearm rotation is the only movement that can keep up with those fingers.
Makes sense.
So what she realized was that there was a way to get across the keyboard rotationally that sends the finger, hand, and arm as a unit across the keyboard, and therefore it can play down.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now, people often think, well, how would all those big movements, how would you possibly play fast with all those big motions? I think it's one of the misunderstood aspects. And look, there's a lot of bad Taubman teaching. There's Taubman teaching that leaves people in these stages where they have these huge motions and it doesn't look even remotely like piano playing. So the point is that the process of learning rotation is a transformative process, and the clearest framework that I can give for that process is exactly like what you would see from an ice cube on. So if you have an ice cube, that's a certain form. Okay, it's H2O. It's still H2O if it melts, but it's now in the form of water. And if you heat that water, it becomes steam. And then if it gets hot enough, it'll evaporate. Okay, now when it evaporates, there's moisture in the atmosphere, right? So you have moisture in the, you don't see it, but you know the absence of it.
Right.
Okay, because you get dry, you can't, eyes get dry, throat gets dry, all of that. We don't see it, but it's there. So when we train someone, we may start with a larger motion so somebody can feel it.
Makes sense.
So we start to train that motion. I don't know if you can see. Is this? Yeah. We train that motion and we produce that rotation on every key. So we would have the fifth finger playing as a preparatory motion, which would send me rotationally to 4, to 3, to 2. Here's my thumb. I continue the rotation, it gets me over. Back to the third finger, to the second finger, and to the thumb.
So you're always working towards the thumb, except right after you've crossed over the thumb, you go the other direction. Is that correct? When you're descending?
Well, we have a whole sort of specificity to the rotation. You are correct. Once we get to the thumb, this is what's called a single rotation. It's a double rotation to the thumb. It's a single rotation to the third finger and another single rotation to the second finger.
Okay.
So there are two coordinations working here, single and double rotation. It's a little bit complicated to explain fully in our short time together, but that's how it functions. What I'm more interested in is explaining that how we go from this, which looks like, this doesn't look like piano playing at all. Okay? So the point is that motion will unify everything, okay?
Makes sense.
And what begins to happen is that the forearm begins to train the fingers and assist them in their lifting. Because fingers have to move to play the piano. There's no such thing as playing the piano and not moving fingers.
Right.
But how those fingers move really make a very big...
Very big. You're so very big. Ну вот поесть и все. Half an hour, actually.